The bathroom door didn't have a lock. I'd checked 3 times before putting on the dress, but somehow I'd missed that crucial detail. Now Robert stood in the doorway staring at me wearing his late wife's blue sundress while his daughter slept upstairs in her childhood bedroom. My name is Shane Collins and I've been married to Amanda for 2 years. This was our first time staying overnight at her father's house since the wedding. Amanda thought it would help us bond. Help Robert feel less alone in the big empty house where he'd raised his family and buried his wife 6 months ago. Instead, I was standing in his downstairs bathroom at 2 in the morning, wearing a dress that smelled faintly of lavender and memories. Robert's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Shock, confusion, anger, then something else I couldn't identify. He stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind him. Not aggressive. Just containing the situation before Amanda woke up and found us like this. We stood there in silence. Me in his wife's dress. Him in pajamas and grief. The fluorescent bathroom light made everything feel overexposed and surreal. He sat down on the edge of the bathtub. Not leaving. Not yelling. Just sitting there like he needed a moment to process what he was seeing. I wanted to explain. Wanted to tell him about Georgia and how she'd existed long before I met Amanda. How I'd thought I could go one weekend without her. How I'd woken up at midnight with that familiar ache and found myself drawn to the boxes in the garage marked Catherine's Clothes Donate. But explanations felt impossible under his tired gaze. Robert looked older than his 56 years. The past 6 months had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there at the wedding. He loved his wife with the kind of intensity that left marks. Now he was alone in a house full of her things trying to figure out how to keep living. He asked why I was wearing Catherine's dress. Not angry. Just genuinely confused about what would possess his son-in-law to sneak downstairs and try on his dead wife's clothing. I told him the truth because lies felt impossible at 2 in the morning in someone else's bathroom. Told him about cross-dressing since I was 17. About Georgia. About how Amanda knew and accepted it, but we'd agreed I wouldn't bring any of Georgia's things to her father's house out of respect. Told him about waking up and feeling desperate. About seeing those boxes in the garage marked for donation. About thinking I could just try on one dress for a few minutes and then put everything back like it never happened. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he stood up and told me to follow him. Led me downstairs to the garage where the boxes sat waiting for a charity pickup that kept getting postponed because he couldn't bring himself to let them go. He opened a different box. One marked, Catherine to Personal. Pulled out a photo album I'd never seen before. The pictures showed a younger version of Catherine. But something was different. Her features. Her build. The way she stood. Robert handed me a specific photo. Catherine at 23 wearing a graduation gown. The name on the diploma said Christopher Marsh. His wife had been transgender. Robert told me the story while we sat on the cold garage floor surrounded by boxes of memories. How Catherine had transitioned at 25 after years of hiding. How her family had disowned her. How she'd moved across the country to start over where nobody knew Christopher. They'd met at a bookstore. Robert was 30 and recently divorced. Catherine was working behind the counter saving money for graduate school. She'd waited 6 months to tell him about her past. Expected him to run. Instead, he'd proposed. They'd been married for 28 years. Built a life. Raised Amanda. Created a world where Catherine could just be Catherine without constantly explaining herself. Amanda didn't know. They decided early on that it wasn't information she needed. That Catherine's past belonged to Catherine and didn't define their family. So Amanda grew up never knowing her stepmother had been born as someone else. Robert had been sitting with this secret alone for 6 months, surrounded by boxes of clothes that held double meaning. Catherine's dresses weren't just dresses. They were proof of the life she'd fought to build, the person she'd become. Then I'd shown up wearing one of them, and Robert saw something he hadn't expected. Saw someone else who understood what those clothes meant. Someone who knew the difference between costume and identity. He asked me about Georgia, about how long I'd been cross-dressing, about whether Amanda really accepted it or just tolerated it because she loved me. about what it felt like to live split between two versions of yourself. I answered honestly. Told him Georgia wasn't a version of me. She was just me. Shane in a dress was still Shane. The clothes didn't change who I was. They just let me express parts of myself that felt suffocated in traditional masculine presentation. Robert cried then. First time since Catherine's funeral, according to him. Cried because he missed his wife. Cried because keeping her secret alone was exhausting. Cried because seeing me in her dress reminded him of the woman she'd been before cancer took her. He asked if I wanted to keep some of Catherine's clothes. Said she would have liked knowing they went to someone who understood their significance. Who wouldn't just donate them to strangers who'd never appreciate what they represented. I told him I couldn't. Told him those clothes belonged to Catherine, and Amanda deserved to have them as memories of her mother. But I appreciated the offer more than he could know. Robert stood up and pulled out a different box. One marked, Catherine to private. Inside were photos and journals and letters. Documentation of her transition. Evidence of who she'd been before she became the woman Robert married. He'd kept everything. Even though Catherine said she wanted it destroyed. Even though she'd asked him to burn it so Amanda would never find out. Robert couldn't do it. Couldn't erase that part of her story, even if she wanted him to. Now he was holding it all out to me. Asking me to keep it. To be the guardian of Catherine's hidden history. To make sure someone remembered the full truth of who she'd been. I told him he should tell Amanda. That she deserved to know about her mother. That keeping secrets like this only made them heavier with time. Robert shook his head. Catherine had made him promise. Had been terrified of how Amanda might react. Had wanted to be remembered as just mom. Just Catherine. Just the woman who raised her daughter and loved her family. But Robert was tired of carrying the weight alone. Tired of pretending his wife had been someone simple when she'd been someone extraordinary. Tired of acting like the past 6 months were just about losing a spouse instead of losing the only person who knew his whole story. We sat in that garage until dawn talking about secrets and grief and the impossible choices we make for love. When Amanda came downstairs looking for us, we were drinking coffee and looking at boxes like we'd been planning a garage sale. She kissed my cheek and told her father it was good to see us bonding. Robert smiled and said I was good company. Better than he'd expected. For the next year, Robert and I had a standing weekly phone call. He'd tell me stories about Catherine. About their early years when she was still figuring out who she could be. About the fear and joy of building a life with someone the world told you didn't exist. Then Robert got sick. Same cancer that took Catherine. Aggressive and fast. Amanda moved him into hospice care and spent every day at his bedside. The night before Robert died, he asked Amanda to bring me. Said he had something important to tell us both. When we arrived, he was lucid but fading. Had that look people get when they can see the end approaching. He told Amanda about Catherine. About Christopher. About everything. Showed her the photos from the box. Explained why he'd kept it secret. Apologized for lying by omission for 30 years. Amanda was quiet for a long time. Then she hugged her father and told him she understood. Told him she'd always known something was different about Mom but never had words for it. Told him she loved them both regardless of what names they'd used or bodies they'd inhabited. My father-in-law caught me cross-dressing in his house. Caught me wearing his wife's dress. But really he recognized someone struggling with the same questions he'd spent a lifetime answering. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who've worn similar masks themselves. If you enjoyed this story, you can find more like it in my Femboy and Crossdressing Stories bundle. 5 complete stories available now on Amazon for just $4.99. Until next time, keep exploring, feeling, and becoming who you are.